Jacob Hansen thought he was simply building a barn on his own property, until the HOA claimed it stood on illegal land and demanded its removal. Led by the inflexible Mrs. Blythe, the HOA seemed determined to punish him, ignoring every document and threatening fines and lawsuits. But Jacob uncovered proof that the barn was entirely his, turning the tables in a way no one expected. And just wait to see how this battle of rules and persistence ended, with justice finally prevailing. Jacob Hansen had always dreamed of finding a quiet corner of the world where he could build a life at his own pace. After years of city noise and cramped apartments, the moment he finally stepped onto his new lot in rural Idaho, he felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Rolling hills stretched before him, dotted with wildflowers and the occasional cluster of pine trees. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of earth and pine needles, and in that instant, he could already picture the barn he would build, a sturdy structure where his horses could shelter and play. He imagined the rhythmic sounds of hooves on the ground, the smell of fresh hay, and the calm evenings spent watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. For the first few weeks, everything went smoothly. Jacob enjoyed mapping out the barn's location, marking stakes in the ground, and sketching designs late into the night. His neighbors, few and far between, nodded politely as he passed them on the dirt road, and life felt pleasantly uncomplicated. He even started planning a small garden, imagining the fresh vegetables he'd harvest during the summer. The sense of peace was almost tangible, like a warm blanket draped over his shoulders. Then, one sunny afternoon, everything changed with the simple arrival of a letter. It was an official-looking envelope, stamped with the logo of the HOA, Homeowners Association, whose jurisdiction covered the neighborhood. Jacob's heart had not registered any warning signs. He hadn't even thought much about the HOA since buying the land. Opening the envelope, he expected perhaps a routine notice about dues or a friendly reminder about community guidelines. What he found inside was something far more alarming. The letter stated that his barn, the very structure he had been dreaming of building, was illegally constructed on common property and must be removed immediately. There were references to community regulations, maps that seemed vaguely official, and warnings about potential fines or further legal action if he did not comply. Jacob read the words over and over, each sentence hitting him like a sudden gust of icy wind. His mind struggled to process the information. Common property? My barn? He muttered to himself, shaking his head in disbelief. How could this be? He had reviewed the lot map multiple times, verified his deed, and double-checked the boundaries. Everything indicated that the barn would sit entirely on the parcel he owned outright. The feeling of shock was instant and all-consuming. He paced back and forth, the letter clutched in his hands, as a cascade of questions and doubts flooded his mind. Had he made a mistake in reading the deed? Was there some obscure law he had overlooked? Why would the HOA assume they had authority over land that was clearly separate from their jurisdiction? The more he thought about it, the less sense it made. His peaceful vision of rolling hills and a quiet life now seemed fragile, threatened by an invisible bureaucracy that he had barely even considered. Jacob's initial calmness gave way to a more complex mix of emotions. He felt the sting of incredulity, a deep and almost physical tension in his chest, as though the ground beneath him had shifted overnight. The barn, which had existed in his mind as a symbol of freedom and simplicity, now appeared as a point of conflict, a potential battlefield he had never intended to enter. And yet, There was a spark of resolve hidden beneath the shock. This couldn't be right, he thought. He had bought this land fairly, legally, and with full awareness of its boundaries. If someone was making a mistake, or worse, overstepping their authority, he would find a way to prove it. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the lot, Jacob sat down on the edge of his future barn site, letter in hand, and tried to make sense of it all. The peaceful Idaho hills remained unchanged, serene and indifferent, but the world of rules, claims, and bureaucracy had suddenly intruded upon his sanctuary. What had started as a dream of calm and freedom had transformed into a perplexing and urgent problem, one that demanded not only attention, but action. The shock lingered, sharp and unnerving, like an unexpected storm passing through a calm valley, signaling that nothing would ever feel quite the same until the truth was uncovered. Jacob Hansen quickly realized that the letter from the HOA was not a simple mistake that could be brushed aside. As he tried to explain his situation, he discovered that the organization wasn't merely mistaken. They were determined. The HOA, led by the formidable and meticulous Mrs. Blythe, had a reputation in the neighborhood for enforcing rules with an iron fist. Mrs. Blythe, a woman in her late 50s with a perfectly coiffed bob and a sharp, no-nonsense demeanor, seemed to take pride in ensuring that every homeowner followed every regulation down to the smallest detail. From painted fences to garden layouts, nothing escaped her attention, and now, apparently, even Jacob's barn had come under her scrutiny. Jacob's first instinct was to call the HOA office and clarify the matter. He dialed the number provided on the letter, hoping that speaking directly with someone would resolve the confusion quickly. The first call lasted over 30 minutes, with Jacob explaining, detailing, and even offering to provide copies of his deed and property maps. On the other end, the receptionist listened politely, then politely reminded him that Mrs. Blythe would review the matter and that any further construction must cease immediately. No matter how clearly Jacob explained, his words seemed to disappear into an administrative void. The second call was worse. This time, Jacob was connected directly to Mrs. Blythe herself. Her voice, precise and measured, cut through his explanations like a sharp blade. She insisted that the barn encroached upon common property and that fines would begin accruing immediately if he did not comply. Jacob presented his documents again, scanned copies of legal deeds, maps showing clear boundaries, and even photos from a recent survey. Mrs. Blythe acknowledged them briefly, then stated coldly that the HOA board had final authority and that the matter would be reviewed, but removal of the structure should proceed in the meantime. With every interaction, Jacob felt his frustration growing, morphing into a deep-seated hatred. It wasn't just the letters or the phone calls, it was the sense of being dismissed, the feeling that no amount of proof could change their position. He wasn't just facing rules, he was facing a machine. The HOA, with its layers of committees, notices, and bylaws, felt like a living entity, impervious to reason, waiting to crush anyone who dared step out of line. And behind this bureaucratic force was Mrs. Blythe herself, a person who seemed to enjoy asserting power over others under the guise of community standards. Jacob began to see the larger picture. It wasn't only the HOA regulations he was up against, it was the undercurrent of neighborly envy that fueled their enforcement. A few neighbors had long eyed his lot with quiet disdain, disapproving of the freedom he had purchased and the space he had carved out for himself. They whispered about the barn before it was even built, speculating whether Jacob's plans would somehow break community harmony. Now, with the HOA's involvement, their subtle disapproval had escalated into a coordinated pressure that felt almost personal. Every day brought another letter, another phone call, another reminder of the fines, penalties, and potential lawsuits. Jacob kept a growing stack of official documents on his kitchen table, each one a symbol of the relentless opposition he faced. He read them over and over, sometimes aloud, as if doing so would allow the truth to pierce the wall of bureaucratic indifference. The feeling of injustice weighed heavily on him, gnawing at his sense of fairness and fueling a quiet but burning hatred, not just toward the HOA as an institution, but toward the system that allowed such rigid enforcement without consideration of facts. And yet, in the midst of this rising anger, Jacob found an unexpected clarity. The intensity of his feelings forced him to focus, to organize his evidence, and to prepare for the confrontation that he now knew was inevitable. Hatred had taken root, yes, but it also sparked resolve. He would not be silenced. He would not allow layers of regulation, official letters, or a powerful woman with a meticulous agenda to erase the rights he had legally purchased. By the end of the week, Jacob was ready. His frustration had sharpened into determination. His anger had become strategy, and his sense of injustice had given him a singular focus. The conflict with the HOA was no longer just an administrative tangle. It was personal, and Jacob's hatred had become the fuel that would drive him toward the battle he knew he had to fight. Jacob Hansen could feel the simmering heat of frustration building into a full-blown storm. Days of ignored calls, threatening letters, and mounting fines had left him no choice. He was done with passive attempts at resolution. Something inside him had shifted. What had started as disbelief and shock, then brewed into frustration and hatred, now solidified into a burning, resolute anger. He refused to be bullied by rules that had no bearing on his own property. He began by returning to the source, his property deeds and surveys. Jacob spent hours in his small home office, spread out over a table that groaned under the weight of papers, maps, and official documents. Each record he examined confirmed what he had suspected deep down. The barn, which had been the subject of every threatening letter from the HOA, was not on common property at all. It sat entirely within a legally separate parcel that he owned outright. The HOA had no authority over it, no bylaws, no rules, and certainly no legal standing to demand its removal. Jacob's heart raced as he cross-referenced boundaries, double-checked surveyor notes, and annotated each map. Each discovery fueled his anger further, not the petty, blind fury of frustration, but a focused, intelligent fire that sharpened his mind. The bureaucrats who had dismissed his calls and skimmed over his documents had assumed he was powerless, but now he held the evidence that would overturn their assumptions entirely. The next step was decisive. Jacob contacted the HOA to schedule a board meeting, a gathering where he could present his case in person. He prepared meticulously, printing copies of every relevant deed, highlighting survey lines, and organizing his evidence into a clear, undeniable presentation. He knew this was not just about paperwork. It was about standing up against a system whim that had tried to intimidate him, to erode his sense of security, and to silence him. The anger that had been simmering for weeks now took the form of purpose. He would confront them directly. When the day of the meeting arrived, Jacob walked into the HOA boardroom with a quiet but unmistakable intensity. Members shuffled papers and exchanged glances, unaware that Jacob carried the key to unraveling their authority over his barn. Mrs. Blythe, ever composed in public, looked up sharply as he entered, her expression a mix of curiosity and thinly veiled irritation. She had expected routine complaints and polite explanations, but what she faced instead was a man armed with incontrovertible proof and unwavering determination. Jacob calmly began his presentation, laying out each document, pointing to survey maps and explaining the legal distinctions between his parcel and the HOA-controlled land. He traced the lines of ownership, connecting deeds and maps with logical precision, leaving no room for doubt. The room grew silent as board members leaned forward, reading and rereading the materials. The energy shifted. Jacob's anger, once private and brewing, had transformed into a visible, commanding force. The moment was electric. Mrs. Blythe's usual sharp confidence faltered as she scanned the evidence. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, whispering quietly among themselves. Jacob could feel the weight of their surprise and the subtle tremor of uncertainty in the room. What had been a relentless machine of bureaucracy and intimidation was suddenly exposed as fallible, human, and, more importantly, wrong. By the time Jacob finished speaking, there was no denying it. The HOA had overstepped its authority. Their demand for him to tear down the barn was illegal, entirely unenforceable, and based on a misunderstanding, or perhaps an overzealous assertion of control. The anger that had propelled Jacob to this moment transformed into something sharper, cleaner. The satisfaction of justice being revealed. The confrontation was no longer about frustration or resentment. It was about reclaiming dignity and asserting rightful ownership. Jacob left the boardroom with his head held high, the echoes of his anger still vibrating in his chest. But it was a controlled, purposeful anger now, the kind that fuels action rather than chaos. The barn stood firmly on his land, untouchable, and the board had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. His battle was not over entirely, but this pivotal moment had shifted the balance. For the first time in weeks, Jacob felt the intoxicating clarity of empowerment. He had faced the system head-on and forced it to confront its own mistakes. The days following Jacob Hansen's confrontation with the HOA were a strange mix of tension and quiet anticipation. Letters were exchanged, phone calls made, and meetings held, each one carrying the weight of uncertainty. Jacob had prepared for every eventuality. He had copies of deeds, legal references, and meticulous documentation of every conversation, yet even with all this preparation, there was a lingering anxiety. What if the HOA refused to acknowledge the truth? What if they continued to push for the barn's removal despite the evidence? But slowly, the tide began to turn. The letters from the HOA became less confrontational, more conciliatory. Phone calls no longer carried threats, but cautious inquiries. It was as if the organization, confronted with undeniable facts, was forced to retreat. Jacob watched the process unfold with a measured sense of triumph. The anger that had driven him earlier, now giving way to quiet satisfaction. Each step of their concession reinforced the sense that persistence, preparation, and knowledge of one's rights could overcome even the most rigid opposition. Finally, After several days of back and forth, the HOA issued a formal statement. They would not pursue the removal of the barn. The words, simple as they were, carried the weight of victory. Jacob felt a rush of relief and pride, a surge that seemed to radiate from the foundation of his small Idaho lot all the way up to the roof of his barn. He walked outside, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the property, and looked at the structure that had caused so much turmoil. The barn stood tall and secure, a tangible testament to his perseverance and steadfastness. Neighbors began to take notice. Whispered conversations carried across the neighborhood. Stories of Jacob's stand against the HOA spread like wildfire, transforming him into an unintentional local legend. Some admired the courage it took to challenge an institution that seemed unyielding. Others nodded in quiet agreement, recalling their own frustrations with regulations and bureaucracy. For Jacob, it was not just about the barn. It was about demonstrating that knowledge, preparation, and resolve could turn a situation that seemed hopeless into one of victory. Even Mrs. Blythe, the rigid and formidable HOA leader, could not escape the acknowledgement of error. In a final meeting to formally close the matter, she admitted the mistake, her tone measured and formal, but her words carried a subtle recognition of Jacob's unassailable position. Jacob listened with a calm, quiet satisfaction. There was no gloating, no overt triumphalism, only the deep, steady acknowledgement that justice had been served and that he had acted correctly, lawfully, and honorably throughout the ordeal. Standing in front of the barn, Jacob allowed himself a moment to reflect. The experience had been exhausting, frustrating, and at times deeply infuriating, but it had also been empowering. He had faced a powerful opponent, navigated complex rules, and emerged victorious. His property was intact. His rights had been upheld, and the sense of personal integrity he felt was stronger than ever. The barn, once a source of stress, now symbolized resilience, justice, and the power of informed action. This victory extended beyond the physical boundaries of his land. It became a story that neighbors shared, a cautionary tale for those who might underestimate the power of persistence, and a source of inspiration for anyone who had ever faced bureaucratic overreach. Jacob's experience proved that being well-prepared, calm, and determined could transform anger and frustration into an effective, triumphant force. As the sun dipped lower, painting the barn in a warm golden light, Jacob ran his hand along the rough-hewn boards and smiled. The satisfaction he felt was not fleeting or superficial. It was rooted in the knowledge that he had stood firm, defended what was rightfully his, and turned a moment of shock, hatred, and anger into a lasting triumph. The barn was more than a building. It was a monument to persistence, courage, and the enduring belief that doing what is right can ultimately prevail over injustice.